And my suspicion is that if political uncertainties in South Africa continue, that South African gold production, particularly the marginal production, which is about 60% of total South African production, will begin to fall fairly precipitously over the next 5 years.
Are you tired of overpaying for your gold, silver, and platinum bullion coins and bars? Then visit sdbullion.com today. SD Bullion was recently named the 177th fastest growing company in the United States by Inc. magazine. This is because they offer the absolute lowest prices in the industry and follow up with over-the-top customer service. So what are you waiting for? Go to sdbullion.com today and join more than 60,000 happy investors that save money on every precious metals purchase they make.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with SilverDoctors.com, and back with us today is Rick Rule, the president of U.S. Sprott Holdings. Rick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
All right. Now, I guess for the first topic, I'd like to get your perspective on how miners are holding up with this precious metal pullback we've seen.
Well, the gold mining equities in the last sort of 2 or 3 weeks have been pretty strong, all things considered. The move in the commodity prices, I guess, has become less unnerving for investors, given how much of it they've experienced over the last 2 or 3 years. My suspicion, of course, and we'll talk about this, I think, later in the interview, is that the prospect of increased merger and acquisition activity in the space has given investors a reason other than the commodity price to own the stocks.
Definitely. And what are some of those other reasons?
Well, I think really we've seen a couple things. The recent acquisition, of course, of the merger between Barrick and Randgold has left open the prospect for more merger and acquisition activity, which is always good for markets. But I think the undertone in the gold mining stocks, the renewed focus on cost, and the more rational allocation of capital that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years has meant that some of the underlying cash flows in the industry relative to the commodity price have surprised investors and surprised them in a positive sense, which I think has contributed to the relative strength in the sector. And when I see relative strength, by conventional metrics, of course, the mining industry is cheap. So when I say relative strength, I really do mean relative strength.
Definitely. And you mentioned the merger between Barrick and Randgold, and this will be the largest, if this goes through, it'll become the largest gold mining company in the world. How will this impact the mining sector? Well,
I think it's potentially very important. One of the problems that the mining sector has had is too much general and administrative expense relative to assets under administration and relative to free cash flow. And hopefully this merger will eliminate some duplicate managerial ranks and lower the general and administrative expense and thus increase free cash flow. It's also true in an era where increasingly passive investment is replacing active investment to some degree, that the larger, more liquid companies enjoy better share price performance, which lowers the industry's cost of capital. So I think the merger is important in at least 3 ways: increasing corporate efficiency, that is lowering general administrative expense, increasing market cap and trading liquidity, and also probably increasing the opportunity set in front of any management team so that they can optimize capital expenditure over a much broader range of asset allocation opportunities. I think good in all 3 ways. Of course, the other thing it does is simply increase interest in the sector. In a well-constructed merger, of course, the shareholders of the acquired company benefit immediately because of what is often a premium price paid, although this merger is constructed as a merger of equals. But also, in a well-constructed merger, the shareholders of the acquiring company benefit too, because over over time, the acquisition is expected to be accretive to the shareholders of the existing company. So I think this is an important development for the gold mining sector, and I think the market has agreed, which I think, in answer to your original question, is the reason for the relative strength of the mining companies, irrespective of the poor performance of the price of gold.
Now, do you think this could impact just the general gold market as well?
I don't. I don't think that the merger will have any impact on the gold price whatsoever. I think it will have an impact, a continuing impact on the price of gold equities.
Now, one of the topics, still on the topic of mining stocks, in South Africa, there's been land repatriation and other political uncertainties in South Africa. How has that affected gold mine supply?
It hasn't impacted gold mine supply yet, but it will. The gold mining industry in South Africa for many years has operated under a fairly uncertain political tenor. And the consequence of that is that gold mining companies have been unwilling or unable in South Africa to make sustaining capital investments. In effect, they've been substituting labor, which is cheap, for capital, which is uncertain. Their ability to continue to do that as the mines get deeper and more cumbersome becomes more doubtful. Their ability to raise the money to make the sustaining capital, investments are challenged on two fronts. The first is, as you suggested, land reform in South Africa, where the proposal from some members of the ANC has been to nationalize land held by white farmers to redistribute it to the historically disadvantaged majority black population, at the same time that some members of the ANC government have proposed a new mining charter which appropriates more cash from an existing cash-strapped industry to the benefit of the state. The idea that you can attract foreign capital to Africa by reducing the impact of the rule of law while at the same time making return on capital employed lower is a very doubtful proposition. And my suspicion is that if political uncertainties in South Africa continue, that South African gold production, particularly the marginal production, which is about 60% of total South African production, will begin to fall fairly precipitously over the next 5 years.
Now, as for the mining industry in Mexico, also there's been issues with respect to violence in Mexico. Are there any concerns about the mining industry in Mexico?
The mining industry in Mexico is fairly healthy. The Mexican government is, relative to other Western Hemisphere governments, fairly pro-mining. There is a strong mining culture and tradition in Mexico, and I think at the local level there's fairly substantial support for the mining industry. The problems with regards to violence and extortion that is promulgated, we believe, by narcotics traffickers. You'll note that at least in the Sierra Madre, the terrain controlled by the narcotics traffickers and the terrain that's prospective for mining is often one and the same, is troubling. The second concern is that there's increasing evidence that, at least at the local level, some of the mine workers' unions are beginning to be controlled by the narcotraficantes, the narcotics traffickers. The recent election to the presidency of Mexico by a former union leader, widely known as AMLO, makes one wonder whether at the federal level the unions will be able to resist incursions by the narcotraficantes, who don't often subject themselves to popular vote, or whether both the unions and the narcotics traffickers-led unions will become a more powerful force. There is a lot of evidence to suggest, at least at the local level, that the workers are intimidated to backing narcotics traffickers-led locals, and that the narcotics traffickers then use control of the labor force to extort production from the miners at a local level. If this continues in Mexico, it'll be a very worrying situation, both for the mining industry and for Mexico as a whole.
And when you say a worrying situation, like what kind of an impact will it make, you think?
Well, we certainly saw that in the United States in the 30s, where the mafia began to take over unions in the United States that controlled things like the Longshoremen's Union and Garbage Workers Union. And that had a deleterious impact, which, of course, you're too young to know about, but it had a deleterious impact in the United States lasting all the way to the 1950s, a circumstance where the narcotics traffickers were able to get control of a labor force and intimidate mine suppliers and others, and as a consequence of that, extort cash payments from the mining companies. A circumstance like that would definitely constrain sustaining capital investments in mining and would probably curtail the development of new mines in Mexico were it to occur. It has the potential of being extremely important. I wouldn't describe it as extremely important yet, but it's certainly something that we need to worry about.
And I know we can't give financial advice on this channel, but what is your perspective of someone who is interested in investing in mining companies? Should they steer clear of investing in ones in Mexico, or what are your thoughts?
I don't believe so. My belief is that Mexican civil society is strong enough that this is a challenge that will be able to be beat back. It's also a truism that, particularly with regards to silver, to a less degree gold, if you want to be invested in silver, your choices really are Peru and Mexico, silver country, places that produce large amounts of silver. So to the extent that you want to be in the silver business going forward, you almost have to include Mexico in your portfolio simply because there's so much silver there.
Very interesting. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And before we let you go, I wanted to touch on one last topic about interest rates. You've talked a lot about the 10-year Treasury yield, and we just saw it in August kind of just touch above 3% and go right back down. But now, it's above 3%. It was mid-September where it went above 3%. What is your perspective on why the yields are rising? Is this related to the Fed raising interest rates recently?
I think partly it's a function of the Fed raising interest rate, and I think it's partly a realization on behalf of savers that interest rates were artificially low. In other words, I think that the strength in the U.S. economy gave the Fed the ability to raise interest rates, which I think maybe not the political forces, but that the Fed wanted to do. And I also think that the market has been demanding higher rates on savings products because the rates that savers were receiving were probably below the ultimate depreciation of the capital that they had saved.
With the rising 10-year Treasury yield, what is that really signaling in the economy right now?
Well, if the economy can sustain it, that's an important question because, we have a very debt-driven economy at the government level, but also at the household level. If the economy can sustain higher interest rates, it probably means a stronger dollar. The United States among developed countries has been the most aggressive in terms of allowing the interest rate to rise. And as a consequence, you've seen a flow of capital out of currencies like the yen, the yuan, and the euro into the U.S. dollar. If the interest rate hikes can be made to stick, that is, as an example, if the increasing 10-year Treasury rate were to increase the 30-year mortgage rate, and if the increase in the 30-year mortgage rate didn't substantially diminish the housing markets, I think you would see a stronger U.S. dollar.
All right. Well, Rick Rule, thank you so much for joining us today. I guess before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had and where they can find you online?
Well, I'm easy to find online, sprottglobal.com or sprott.com. One of the things that I like is visiting with your listeners, and to give them an incentive to do that, I am always willing to do no obligation portfolio ranking. If your subscribers will email me their natural resource portfolios, both with company name and symbol in the text, not as an attachment. If you email that to me personally at rrule, that's RRULE, at sprottglobal.com, I will email back rankings of the companies in the portfolio. The rankings are 1 to 10, 1 being best, 10 of course worst, and comments occasionally accompany rankings where that's appropriate.
All right. Once again, Rick Rule, thank you so much for your time today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.